Thank you, Keith. I sense a little bit of passion in the room about stewardship and about generosity. Welcome to all of you who have gathered here today and those who are listening remotely. I thank you for your interest and for your time. So what exactly is this generosity project? It's a lively, interactive experience for all ages that connects generations and equips households as the center for the faith practice of generosity. The Generosity Project is usually a 3.5 to 4 hour workshop on a Saturday morning or possibly a Sunday afternoon. It's often hosted by synods or possibly a group of congregations. And these are the goals: to model a congregation's potential, to connect and equip all ages as steward leaders, stories we've already heard in some of the former presentations, to experience conversations about faith and finance, to equip households as places where generosity is practiced 24/7, 365, not just in the fall, not just for a fall campaign. In addition, there's goals to grow a culture of generosity in synods, in congregations, beginning with our households. There's a goal for participants to stir their imagination of all that's possible. What does it mean to resource households as centers of generosity? And finally, to grow a spirit of generosity and joy that overflows from households to congregations and to synods. In the ELCA, we often talk about 3 expressions of the church. But I would like to challenge you to say that we have 4 expressions of the church, and it begins with our households. The guiding principles are these: that generosity is essential as a daily practice of one's faith. Generosity is a faith practice best formed in households. That when values and finance are discussed between people of all ages, that we start to build trust and we start to create a culture and a place that we can easily talk about money. And as Christians, that our daily decisions to share, to save, and to spend are shaped by God's story in each of us and how we make decisions and live those out. And finally, that all of us are stewards, regardless of our age. Taking a look at this picture, this is one congregation where all ages gathered to celebrate stewardship. It's a foundational concept that your faith community is an untapped potential to bring all the ages together. It's one that we often, rather than being age separated, but to bring everyone together, is an incredible potential to become centers for generosity and to talk about generosity. So the beginning of the Generosity Project started in 2011 in the Rocky Mountain Synod. The Synod received a Macedonia grant. Together with my colleagues at the time, the Director of Evangelical Mission, Jim Hitchen, the person who was coordinating stewardship, Dan Bowman, and myself, I was on staff in the area of faith formation. We brought mission, stewardship, and faith formation together and created this focus on households and the idea of bringing generations together, all ages, to talk about stewardship. We were supported and guided by gifted leaders throughout the Synod, throughout the Rocky Mountain Synod as an advisory team. I have to say, and maybe it's just me, but I don't really have the words that are adequate to describe what this Generosity Project looks like because it's so interactive. So the next slides that you're going to see are really photographs of what happens at a workshop. And I'm going to describe, as you look at these photos, a little bit about what's happening. So hopefully that your imagination will be stirred by these photographs, and you at the end of this will say, when can we schedule a generosity workshop? The Generosity Project is about gathering at God's table. It's giving thanks for God's generosity. And so when people walk into the space, the first thing they see is this table. On one end are the Lord's elements from the Lord's table, and on the other end is elements might be from a picnic table or a household table, or it could be a Starbucks cup. But the idea that we gather at the Lord's table and we gather at our household tables. All ages are invited to participate in the workshop. In fact, it's the key element that we have 3-year-olds, and we've even had 102-year-olds all gathered into one space. 7 to 8 generations represented and decades. Of course, hospitality is key, as is food, and so that hospitality team is just essential in helping plan this workshop. The generosity is also about making pigs. So when the children and youth walk in, or adults who want to be like children for the day, they're invited to make pigs. When you look at this photo and I see elementary boys engaged in making pigs and young girls as well, I think right there is a measure of success. To just have that many children engaged, and they often don't want to leave the making of their pigs. And of course these pigs are something that they take home, and we do a blessing of the pigs at the very end of the workshop. As people arrive, they are invited to place a dot on their name tag. In fact, I have a reputation of, Linda must have been here. Everybody has dots on their name tags. But the name tags represent the year that they were born and the generation that they come from. The colored dots become a visible symbol that we are all stewards, that regardless of age, no one is too young, no one is too old to be a generous giver. And we've already heard stories from our other speakers about that this morning. Early in the workshop, we form what is called a circle of blessing. A circle is formed from the oldest to the youngest one present, according to age and decade. It really is one of my favorite parts of the workshop. We always take time to honor the oldest, and I always say, and you also get the title of wisest for that day, the wisest one present. We hear a little bit of their faith story. And then we identify the youngest, and then we introduce the youngest and the oldest to one another as bookends for this circle of blessing. From that circle of blessing, we count off and we form small groups of 5 or less. And they're intentionally mixed ages. And within those small groups, we have conversation. And the questions are a question that anyone could answer regardless of age. For example, who is the most generous person you know? So if you're 3, you might say, my mommy, or my grandpa. But other stories of people that have been generous throughout your life. Another example of a question is, what is your earliest memory of something that you saved for? Now imagine an 80-year-old or someone who is 10. Very different stories. But through these questions, through the exchange of ideas and values between ages, we start to create an environment of trust. And eventually, yes, we're talking about money. And how often have you heard people say, oh, we can't talk about money in our congregation? But in bringing ages together and in this safe environment, we start to talk about money. A key aspect of the generosity workshop is distinguishing between what we call the world story of spend, 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 and God's story of abundance and generosity and sharing. To lift up the differences in our narratives, what we call our Christian narrative and the narrative that surrounds us in the world, we play a game called Give and Get. How many of you have possibly already played that game? It's a fun game of exchanging M&Ms, but there's no talking. One brave pastor, after being present at the workshop, went home that Sunday and did this with like 300 people during the worship hour and instead of the sermon. And it's fun to hear the result of that. At the end of the game, we ask this question: who was the winner? Followed by an in-depth look at marketing strategies that shape our attitudes, our values, as consumers and as households. This fun game and discussion is followed by celebrating God's story. God's story of, as one of our teenagers called it, crazy generosity. The story of the Macedonians, the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and we know that there were even more than 5,000 there. And in fun ways, we have the small groups act out this story. We have spontaneous actors theater in making these stories come alive during the workshop. After hearing and acting out and making God's story come alive in this group, time is spent sharing our own values, challenges in being a steward, and stories related to our stewardship. This is always done, as you'll notice by the photographs, in small groups. Age diversity is present, but in groups that are often 5 or less. Now really look at this photo and these photos. Do you notice how people are leaning in? It's probably for me the highlight of these workshops, that the Holy Spirit shows up. It doesn't matter if there's 30 or in rooms where there's been 150. There's just this hum, as the Holy Spirit, I think, is just buzzing over the top of these small groups and engaged in these conversations. Look at the photo in the lower right. This was at a workshop. The woman, the elder woman you see, she's 102. The young girl is 10. They had never met before, but they just kind of gradually were drawn to each other. And as they're leaning in and listening, they grabbed each other's hands. Along with personal stories, we lift up bright spots. We have the people present, because they're there from usually a variety of congregations, tell their own stories through writing them down on little sticky notes. Stories of generosity in your own household, in your congregation. What do you know that's happening in your synod? How is your synod generous? And then also, what do you know about the ELCA? And how is the ELCA serving and generous into all the world? During the generosity workshop, we teach and we practice the concept of share, save, spend. Some of you may know it as the 10-10-80. We give out dimes to the children, and we practice. And we practice telling those stories. Another thing that we have households do is that in giving them dimes and practicing, we have them identify what are they saving for, what are they sharing, and what are their big budget items, and then we post them for all to see. Before the end of the workshop, like many workshops, we don't want people just to go home and it's like, well, that's it. We have them gather both in congregational groups and in households to make a plan. What did they hear during the workshop that they can celebrate and going, yay, we already do that? What could we tweak to be just stronger in our generosity and in our stewardship? And what's a new idea that maybe we heard from someone else today that's happening in another congregation, or something that we heard from leaders? It's an important part of the workshop that we do truly equip households as they go home. So as they gather in their household group again, we give them tools to take home. One of the tools that we use is the Faith Incubator's Faith 5 Stewardship bookmark. And in that, using the Faith 5, they learn how to daily express their gratitude and their gratefulness. And often we partner with Thrivent to utilize the blue pigs that have share, save, spend slots. These are all reminders of God's story. Of course, I told you about the pigs that the children have made. We bless those. And I always say there's no such thing as a craft. We're never making crafts. We're only making reminders of the story. So our households go home with items from the workshop that they will have as visual reminders of what's happened this day. One aspect of the Generosity Workshop is simply a new understanding. People, again, their comment is, "My imagination was stirred." The workshop is about modeling what happens when generations come together. I have found in my experience that often congregations have forgotten how to have all the generations together. Maybe they are together in worship or the coffee and Kool-Aid hour, but what does it mean to really talk to one another, to look at each other in one another's eyes, to hold one another's hands as they're engaged in these conversations? So as they come together, they truly have a new understanding of what it means to connect generations, to equip households as the centers of generosity. The research that's being done today tells us that that's where generosity begins, is in our homes or with people that we really trust and who love us. In 2015 and 16, we had 7 synods host and pilot the Generosity Project. We have congregations and synods that are planning to host in this coming year as well. Whoops, I think no, that's the right slide, sorry. Last fall, we gathered and we launched a new leadership network. This network is made up of leaders from those pilot synods as well as others who we know who are creative and will be helping us write curriculum. But this group of 18 is now commissioned and they're ready to serve. They're ready to be asked by you to come and lead workshops both in the synods and within your regions. I think we have a manual here, yes. So the binder that we've been using, and we keep changing it and tweaking it as the pilot, as we learn from the pilots, as we've learned from participants, so everything right now is in a binder. But going forward, this fall, all of the materials will be available for, thank you Keith, will be available for download from the ELCA website and available to anyone to use. But in the meantime, if you have questions, whoops, do we want to go back? There we go. If you have questions, you can email me, but also talk to your Director of Evangelical Mission and talk about scheduling a workshop for your synod or for a group of congregations. So thank you so much, and we look forward to having these conversations and scheduling a generosity project where you are.